Our presentation today, Puffins and Petrels, Seabirds in the field. We're mostly going to be focusing on how we study these really amazing birds in the field. And I'll talk a little bit about their biology and different types of birds, but we're not going to get too much into the specific biology of all the birds today. There's just so much to talk about in terms of field research. So we'll be talking a lot about that today. But that said, I am going to start off by talking about what a seabird is, just so we're all on the same page. The basic definition of a seabird is just a bird that makes its living from the ocean. So it's finding food in the ocean. It lives on and around and near the ocean. They pretty much spend their entire lives out over the open water. And this definition can really change depending on which biologist or seabird biologist or ornithologist you're talking to. Some consider only birds that you can't see at all from shore to be seabirds. But for my purposes, I think that any bird that relies on the water and is therefore part of that ecosystem is considered a seabird. So that's kind of the definition I'll be working with today. To make it easier for them to live in this habitat, they've got a lot of really cool adaptations. And a couple I can talk about today are that they tend to have really thick waterproof feathers, which allows them to be able to dive into the water to catch food like fish and squid and other things that are in the water. That'll keep them nice and dry so they don't get too cold. A lot of them will also have these thick layers of fat. If you've ever pictured like a penguin, that keeps them warm in the really cold water that they tend to be diving into. Because they live near salt water, so they're drinking salt water and they're eating really salty food. A lot of seabirds also have these special glands positioned above their eyes that actually remove excess salt from the water and from their food, which is really cool. In terms of their body shapes and sizes, they tend to fall into two basic categories that are kind of evolved for two different types of foraging strategies. Foraging just means when they're looking for food. So there's the first category of birds, like this tufted puffin, which tend to dive for prey that are in dense schooling balls. So these are a lot of fish that are forming these really dense schooling balls. So the puffins will dive into the water and catch a lot of these fish for themselves and for their chicks. So they've got these really small, dense, football-shaped bodies. When I worked for Project Puffin, we would tell people, look for a football with wings flying by. That's how much they look like footballs. Their wings tend to be short and kind of stubby. And so this allows them to basically fly through the water. If they had longer wings, there would be a lot more resistance from the water. So it allows them to really swim through the water pretty well. These birds can also fly, as you see here, and walk, although they are not incredibly adept at either one. They're really, really good at swimming, but they're kind of funny if you see them waddling on the land. Other birds that fall into this category, like penguins, can't fly, but they are even more adept at swimming than these puffins are. Besides the puffins, some other birds that fall into this category would be birds like these murres, which are pretty similar looking to penguins, and we'll talk more about these specific species later. The guillemots, which are one of my favorites, so I'll talk a lot about those a little bit later, and other auklets like this rhinoceros auklet, which is also pretty much a penguin. Some birds you may be more familiar with from the shore, like cormorants or pelicans, also loosely fall into this category, although their body plans aren't as extreme as some of these other birds that are more what we call pelagic, which means they're pretty much only found out over the open water. So our second category of birds are birds like the shearwater that tend to fly over much longer distances, hundreds of thousands of kilometers and miles. And these birds are looking for prey that instead of being really small and dense together in these schooling balls, they're spread over a much longer distance and they're more scattered. So these birds' bodies have evolved to help them fly over really long distances and look for all this food that's really spread out. And they tend to be more and more warmer waters, although that's not always the case. They're pretty spread out. These birds have relatively smaller, slimmer bodies, not so much of that football shape, and their wings are really thin and long, and this allows them to be super efficient flyers. So in this picture, you can see the shearwater. Look how long those wings are, much longer than even their bodies. They're really, really great at flying long distances. These birds also tend to have a heightened sense of smell, which is unusual for birds. Most birds don't have a great sense of smell. But a lot of these birds that are the long distance flyers fall into a category called tube noses. And they have what looks like tubes on their noses, their nostrils, and we'll see some up close pictures of them later. But they actually can smell a lot better than a lot of other birds. And scientists now think that they're using this keen sense of smell in order to help them find zones in the water where there's more prey. And I won't start talking about that now, but it's a really interesting topic. So I'd love to talk about it at a later date if anyone's interested. But besides birds like the albatross, which people might be more familiar with, those are also tube noses, shearwaters like this picture. We have petrels. There's larger petrels and there's storm petrels like this picture, which is another one of my favorites. Terns would also fall into this category, although they are not tube noses. Their bills are much longer and thinner. They don't have those enlarged nostrils, but they do have those smaller bodies and those really long, thin, slim wings that allow them to be great long distance flyers. And in fact, the Arctic tern, which this is not a picture of, have one of the longest annual migrations of any animal on Earth. Each year they migrate from the Arctic Circle to the Antarctic Circle. So that's a round trip journey of over 18,000 miles every year. So these little birds can really travel the distance, and their bodies have evolved in order to allow them to do so really, really efficiently, which is pretty amazing to think about. There's also birds like gulls, skuas, jaegers, and fulmars, which all look more or less like the gulls that we're all familiar with, which we won't be talking as much about today, but have very similar body shapes, just not as extreme as these tube noses and these terns. So these are kind of the basics of the seabirds we'll be talking about today, and I'll get a little bit more into the specifics of the birds that I have personal experience with in a bit. So for the most of the talk today, we'll be talking about how we study these birds. And one way that we can study them is by conducting these marine bird and mammal surveys. Pretty much we're going out on the water on these boats and we're zigzagging across as much of the water as we can cover. And we're just constantly observing and recording everything that we see out there, out in their habitat. And these are great surveys to do because they can take place year round. They're not really dependent on specific times of the season, as long as we can get out over the water safely. We can record things like the species that we're seeing, how many of each species we're seeing, maybe the direction the birds are flying or moving, any interesting behaviors that we're seeing these birds do. And these surveys give us really important information about how many birds are out there and their ranges, and if that's changing from year to year, which is especially important in light of changes in ranges and foraging behaviors with climate change. So they can be really important ways to study these birds. I took this picture from a boat from a NOAA research cruise I was lucky enough to be a volunteer on a summer when I was in my master's program. It went out for 2 weeks and it left from Massachusetts where I was working and went all the way down to Virginia and then up to Nova Scotia and back again, and stopped at a bunch of different sites along the way to do water sample studies. And every time the boat was moving, there were marine bird and mammal volunteers up in the top deck looking around and recording everything we saw. So I got to take a lot of cool pictures, and it was kind of an introduction for me into seabird research. So that's where I got this picture of the shearwater. And again, you can see that really long, thin wings that help them be really efficient at long distance flying and foraging. So although these surveys are a really great way to get a lot of this information, the bulk of seabird research is conducted on land at these summer breeding colonies. And this is where I've done a lot more of my research as well. These are really ideal for field research for a few reasons. These colonies are really the only time that these birds are on land throughout the year. For the most part, a lot of these seabirds live out on the open water, and they only come onto land during the summer to form these colonies to lay their eggs. So although they're adapted for life on the water, their eggs need to stay dry and their chicks need to stay dry until they're old enough to go out on the water and they get their adult feathers in, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. A lot of these birds are often monogamous, so they'll find the same partner, keep the same partner through the whole season, and oftentimes they will find the same partner from previous years, year after year. They also do this thing called nato-filipatry, which just means that generally speaking, they go back to the same island where they were born every year to find a partner and lay eggs and raise their chicks. So it makes it really ideal for field research because first of all, it's on land, so it's easier for researchers like us to live amongst the birds for the season. It's also the one time that we know these birds will be in this location every year at this place. So when you're out over the open water, you're just kind of observing whatever's out there. It's luck. luck of the draw. But here on these islands, you know these birds are here year after year, so it's a really great place to be able to study them. So a lot of the pictures that I have and what I'll be talking about today is research that I was a part of while I was living on some of these seabird colonies. Before I get into the research aspect, I just want to go briefly over the two islands where I lived for the summer, just so you have an idea of where these birds were located and where all these pictures were taken. This colony is a colony of murres taken out in California, by the way, which I'll talk a little bit more about later as well. So the first breeding colony were the Farallon Islands, which you can see here in this picture. This is actually the view of the islands coming up to them from the boat. Many of these seabird colonies are, as you can see, fairly remote, kind of off the beaten path, not really people living there, or the birds themselves wouldn't be able to come to the islands. The islands also tend to be in really highly productive areas, by which I mean there's a lot of food for these birds to find in the surrounding water. These birds are fending not just for themselves, but for their chicks. So they need to be able to find a lot of food and resources out there. And there needs to be not too many predators, such as humans, in the area, or the colonies won't really be successful. So the Farallon Islands are 30 miles off the coast of San Francisco, so pretty far off the beaten path. It's pretty far out there. When I tell people I spent the summer on an island in California, I think they have a very different image in their mind and how it actually was. It was a great experience, but we were not sitting out on the beach in our bathing suits. It was about 50 degrees, pretty foggy there the entire summer, and really windy since you're really far off the shore. Pretty windy the entire time we were out there. The entire islands are pretty small. We lived on Southeast Farallon Island, or known as Sephi, which I will probably flip into calling it, which is the island right in the middle with the really tall peak on the top. And on the top is a little lighthouse, and here it is here, the lighthouse on the top, which is not operational when we were there, but there were still some of the buildings that were left over at that point. So the Sephi is only about less than 1 square mile, so it's a pretty small island. But on this island, every summer, over 300,000 birds come to lay their eggs and raise their chicks. Out of those 300,000 birds, there are 12 different species. So it's a really important nesting site. It's the largest seabird breeding colony in the continental US, and it's home to 30% of California's breeding seabirds. So it's a really important place to study these birds. So every summer, up to 6 researchers go out and live on the island for the duration of the summer. And this research is conducted by Point Reyes Bird Observatory, which I think they now call themselves Point Blue. And they do a lot of this really important research and they work with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who technically own and run the island because it is protected. So visitors can't just come onto the islands, they have to be part of the research or coming on as volunteers. But they've been going and conducting the seabird research since 1968, which is a really long time, which is really cool to be able to monitor these populations over such a long period of time. There's a lot of other research going on there as well, such as marine mammal research. So in the summer when we were there were not only all these birds, there were also thousands of elephant seals and sea lions and harbor seals all over that island as well, kind of causing a ruckus. So if you can imagine coming up to this island on a boat after several hours sailing from the mainland, the first thing you notice about the island, depending on the way the wind is blowing, is either the sound of hundreds of thousands of birds and seals or the smell. And it's not necessarily a bad smell, but it is a distinctive smell. So it smells like the island, and it has a smell like no other. So you know you're coming up on it even before you see it when you're up on the boats. The island is not easy to get onto. It's not really habitable for people. There's not a dock or anything. So in order to get on the island, we actually transfer us and our belongings from the big boat that came out into a smaller boat. And the crane operator, which you can see up here, swings this crane over, and we attach the hook to the boat, and then they swing the boat up and over, and it lands right up here next to the sign, and we unload everything. So that's how you get on and off the island. Typically, boats come out to the island every 2 weeks, with new biologists coming onto the island, and then any food or supplies that we might need. And then they leave the island with biologists who need to get back to the mainland, and they take off any trash that we weren't able to compost or to burn, although we try to do that for the most part as much as we can. So it's not super easy getting on and off the island. It's definitely an adventure. When you're on the island, we get along mainly on these little paths that you can see along the bottom. We try not to leave the paths as much as you can because you never know when there's some seabird burrows all over the place, so you don't want to step on those. Most of the island looks a lot like this. It's very rocky, not a lot of vegetation. There are gulls all over the place. Most of the other seabirds are hiding, but the gulls don't care. So they're just kind of out all over the place. If you've ever seen the movie The Birds, it was a lot like that when we were there. For most of the season on the Farallones, because there are these western gulls nesting all over the place, they get incredibly aggressive once their chicks are born. So we spent most of the season, every time you go outside, you suit up and you have to put a hard hat on because these birds will fly at you with their bills and they mean to draw blood, and they will if you don't have a hard hat on. But we were lucky enough on the Farallones to live in these houses, which is somewhat unusual for seabird field research. Usually you're living more in a tent situation. These houses were left over from when the lighthouse was operational. So we did live inside, and we even had running water, although the water was collected during the rainy season. So we had to be very careful with our water usage because if we used all of it, there wasn't any more. So you had to be pretty careful with it. But we did live inside and we did have running water, which was very nice. This is another view from the top of that lighthouse hill. So you can really see it's just a lot of rocks. There's not a lot of vegetation with the exception of these two trees, which are on either side of the houses protected by the wind. Otherwise, it's mostly rocks and very, very low vegetation. So those are the Farallon Islands, and we'll come back to the birds that we had on the Farallones in a few minutes. But wanted to go over the other island that I was a part of the research of, which was Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge. And Seal Island is on the other side of the country. So this one's off the coast of Maine, 22 miles from the mainland. So again, pretty far off the beaten path. It's even smaller than Cefi was. It's just about a mile long and only a couple hundred kilometers wide at its widest. So it's really just this long, skinny rock, more or less, with a lot of birds on it. Only about a tenth of a square mile at its biggest. So it's pretty tiny, and there's less species overall that nest on seal, only about 6 species. But the reason why it's such a cool, important site is because it's part of Project Puffin, which again, I could talk for a whole hour just about Project Puffin, but I won't, I promise. All I'll say is that Project Puffin is a really cool project run by Audubon. They've been working out on Seal Island since the mid 80s, but Project Puffin itself began on other islands, Egg Rock, closer to the land in the mid 70s. It was run by biologist Steve Kress, whose goal was to bring puffins and other nesting seabirds back to these places where they nested historically on the coast of Maine. They'd all been wiped out by this point, overhunting by humans and by gulls and some other predators. So they aimed to use this really novel technique called social. So Project Puffin interns and researchers out on all of these 6 or 7 birds every summer. So I was lucky enough to live out on Seal for the first 2 weeks of the summer that I worked for Project Puffin, helping out with the research and everything. And then I actually spent the rest of the summer on the mainland as an education intern. So this is a picture of me on one of the boats. So these boat cruises go around some of the islands that are closer to the mainland and educate tourists and birders about puffins and the social attraction technique used for Project Puffin. This is a picture of me doing an interesting imitation of a cormorant and what we call the Dracula for fish. So we would tell people about the project and the birds we would see, and then help point out the birds that were out there on these boats. So it was a really interesting experience for me. And we like to go out to the islands first, so we're able to really tell people on these boats about this research from a firsthand experience. So a lot of my pictures were from when I was on the island and when I was on the boats, both on Seal Island and then also on the Farallon Islands. Seal Island has a little bit more vegetation than Cefi does, although no trees at all. And we do have just this one little building that we primarily used to make our food and to hang out during the day if it was a little rainy and to keep all the research safe. But we didn't live in a nice cushy building on this island. In fact, we did not even have running water on this island. Boats came out every 2 weeks again and brought out biologists and food, but we also brought out big jugs of water as well. So we had to be pretty conservative with our water on this island. Here's a view of my lovely bedroom, my tent right here. As you can see on this platform, there's another tent back there. They were kind of spread all around this area. and a view on the right of my view at the tent every morning, which was pretty amazing, living on these islands with all of these birds and just 4 or 5 other people for the duration of those 2 weeks. It was an amazing experience. And I took a lot of pictures. And although that picture looked beautiful, this is a much more realistic representation of what the islands look like during the summer. This is Maine, so it's pretty dark, pretty foggy, pretty windy again. Great for birds, but it can get a little bit slippery out there. Still a really, really cool experience for me to have. Right, so what are we doing on this island? Why are we living on these uninhabited rocks in the middle of the ocean? We are monitoring these seabird colonies, and there's a couple of different ways that we can do that throughout the summer. We can study the mating behaviors of these birds, anything they're doing kind of before laying their eggs and during, whom they're mating with, and if that changes from year to year, looking at their burrow and or nest locations and whether or not that's changing. The phenology of this entire process, and phenology just means the timing of everything. So do they come back to the islands the same time every year? Are they changing when they lay their eggs, when their chicks fledge, things like that. The reproductive success, so whether or not their chicks fledge successfully, and the diet, what are they feeding their chicks, and is that linked to their reproductive success at all? And this is a picture of some Brandt's cormorants, and it looks like some sea lions out on Seppi. I have a lot of pictures of these cormorants because we can get pretty close to them in one of our bird blinds. To make it a little bit easier to talk about all these different birds and the techniques we use to study them in the field, I tried to split them into 2 main categories. The birds with nests like these who are visible that you could see, and the birds with burrows or nests that we can't see as much because the techniques vary a little bit. So we'll start first with the birds with visible nests like these cormorants. These nests either tend to be constructed with sticks and algae like these cormorants do. On the technique that's much more common is the less is more strategy employed by terns, gulls, murres, and a lot of other birds. Murres go with the penguin strategy of I will just sit on this egg on the ground. Less is more. Other birds like terns and gulls will make just like a little shallow divot in the ground and lay their egg in it so it doesn't roll away. But they don't do a lot in the way of nest construction the way that the cormorants will do. A lot of times these birds are very skittish, so we can't just walk right up into the colony or they would all fly or run away, and then their eggs and chicks would be cold and probably eaten by a lot of gulls in the area. So we don't want to flush the birds away from their colonies. So we observe them from bird blinds, which are structures with just little holes to see through that are constructed near these areas. So we can watch them without disturbing them overly much. And then throughout the season, we'll just monitor them every few days and monitor selected nests and try to record as much as we can about these birds throughout the season. This is a picture of what some of those bird blinds might look like. These are out on Seal Island. As you can see on the left here, each of these blinds has a name. So this is the sea parrot. So every day at breakfast, we would all kind of talk about the research we're doing that day. Everyone would have their individual assignments and go off to their specific blinds. And you could just spend hours in these blinds observing these birds and trying to record all the information you can about them. A couple of the birds that I have pictures of that fall into these categories that I was able to study are the Brandt's cormorants, which are similar if you're on the East Coast. We have much more common the double-crested cormorant, which still have those bright blue eyes, but these guys also have these really bright blue gular pouches underneath their bills, which is really, really striking. They're pretty cool birds to be able to see. Also the pelagic cormorant, which are a little bit smaller than the Brandt's cormorants, and they have this white on their flank, but we were also able to study them out on Seppi. And then we have some terns. These pictures of these terns were all taken up on Seal Island off the coast of Maine. If you haven't seen terns before, or you may have seen them but not realized that you saw them, they more or less look like gulls, but they're smaller, more elongated, more slender, and much less aggressive in general and loud than terns. More pleasant, it's more of a squeaky sound and less of a raucous crying like the gulls tend to have. A lot of terns have this black cap on their head, although they don't always. So the common terns have this black on the end of their bill, which differentiates them from the Arctic terns, which also nest on these islands, which tend to have an all red bill and a little bit more of a longer forked tail. Some of the islands also have roseate terns, which are exciting because they are listed in some places as endangered or threatened. And the roseate terns have a much more black bill, generally speaking. They get their name from this almost peachy tone to the bottom of their breasts that the adults who are breeding plumage usually get. It's very subtle, but it's there if you look for it, or you just have to take my word for it. We also have common murres, who we saw the pictures of earlier, who look very similar to penguins. And we often got asked on our boat cruises the question, are these birds penguins? What's the difference? And the answer is no, they're not penguins. They're just a different species of seabirds. And the reason these murres look so similar to penguins is because these birds have evolved to live in the same habitat. So they have similar body shapes and sizes and colors because that body shape and size and color plan works for living in the water and for catching fish. So they co-evolved it separately, but they are not actually penguins. In fact, these can fly, not gracefully, but they can fly. Penguins cannot fly, but they're pretty cool birds. And of course, we have to mention the gulls. Although gulls don't necessarily have to depend on the water, these birds are an intricate part of this ecosystem. So out on Seppi, we had the western gulls, which are really smart and very aggressive and nest kind of all over the island, but were pretty striking when you got up close to them, like this gull right here. So during the season, things we could observe and record at the beginning of the season especially were mating behaviors. Some seabirds have really fascinating mating behaviors. If you've never seen a video of an albatross mating pair dancing at the beginning of the season, definitely look it up because it's a pretty cool thing to be able to see. I don't have videos of that, unfortunately, but I do have pictures of this, which is Brent's cormorant bringing some nesting material back to the nest. So with the cormorants, the males actually build up the nest at the beginning of the seasons, and then the females will walk around and choose a mate based on how good of a job he does building his nest up. The males will also then do this amazing display in front of their nest where they fling their heads back and show their blue sack off to the world. It's pretty cool. And then if that wasn't enough, they then fling their wings out like this and flutter them in the air, which is apparently very attractive if you are a cormorant female. But it's a pretty cool thing to be able to see, especially on sunny days like this, where I was able to capture just how iridescent these birds are up close. Pretty cool thing to be able to see. Because these nests are out in the open, we're able to pick specific nests out from the colonies to observe for the entire season. So we can't observe every nest. 300,000 birds is a bit much. So we try to select nests that are visible, like this patch of nests here that you can see into, and that have birds that have bands on their legs so we know which individual is which if we can. These guys are a little bit easier to see into. Other species like the pelagic cormorants that like to nest on random cliff faces are a little bit more difficult, but we do our best with that as well. And then this is a picture of what a tern study plot might look like. Again, the terns go with the less is more strategy. So you can see over here 2 eggs just on the ground. So we go at the beginning of the season and put out these orange stakes with numbers at all the different nests that we want to study throughout the season. As you walk through the nest colony, all of the terns rise up into the air very dramatically and shout at you. As soon as we leave, they land again. So there's very minimal disturbance, which is why it's okay to kind of walk through the colony once or twice, although we try not to do it more than once or twice a day so we don't disturb them overly much. I like this picture especially because you can see the researchers down here are holding something up in the air, a binder. So these birds are small, but they will dive bomb you and try to speck you in the head with their bills because you were disturbing their eggs. It does hurt, even though they're small, but they are easily distracted. So as long as you hold something up in the air, like a binder or a flag, they will hit that instead of your head. So many people just walk through like this with your hand up in the air, kind of just getting used to that throughout the season. And then there's the murres, which again are very similar to penguins in their life history, and they will just sit on their eggs on the rocks, all in a really big clump of thousands of them like this. The murres are pretty flighty, so we can't really get into this colony, and it's a fairly remote area. So in order to observe them, we walk up to this blind here, and if you follow the pointer, the path looks, this is the path that we walk up. You have to be kind of a mountain goat to live on these islands sometimes. You walk up this little path like this and then go into the back of the blind. And then you end up looking down on the study plot, which is within the circle. So the biologists on this island have been studying this specific spot for years and years and years and years, the specific birds that come and nest in these areas in this specific spot. So they're able to kind of follow the lineages of these birds that way instead of concentrating on all of the birds, which would be a little bit too much to handle. Once we pick the nests that we want to study, we can start to record the numbers of eggs and chicks that we're seeing throughout the season, which sounds easy, but can be kind of difficult considering it's really windy and cold on these islands. So these birds spend the majority of their time sitting on the eggs, hunkered down, not moving. Every once in a while, one will get up like this cormorant, adjust some eggs, and then sit back down again. But it's a pretty quick glimpse that you get in trying to record what you see. So this cormorant is sitting on at least 3 eggs, but we can't see the entire nest, so we would write 3+. So there might be more, but we're just not sure. There's at least 3 eggs on that nest. The terns can be even more difficult since they just sit on their eggs and they don't really get up unless they're switching pairs, if one of the pairs is out foraging and one's sitting on the eggs. So when they get up, you can kind of get a good glimpse like this at these beautiful tern eggs, which are kind of green and have this nice speckling to help them camouflage since they do lay them on the ground. But otherwise, it's a little bit more difficult to see these tern nests. So to test how good we all are at being seabird biologists, I have a test. And behind this picture, there's behind this box, there's a picture of a cormorant kind of sitting up on a nest a little bit. In the field, you would pretty much only have about 5 seconds to really see into that nest and record what you're seeing. So my test for you is in a couple seconds, I'm gonna remove this gray square. And I want everyone to look into the nest and see if you can see how many eggs and how many chicks you see inside. And then you can type it into the chat and then Harrison will share with us what everyone's seeing. After those 5 seconds, I'm gonna bring the square back again and give everyone a second or two to type your answers in, and then I'll go to a more zoomed in view so we can see what's in there. So I'm gonna count down from 3, 2, 1, and then I'll remove the rectangle and let everyone see it. So hope everyone's ready. Right, 3, 2, 1. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. And then the bird would have sat back down again, and that's all that you would have seen. So if you have an idea of what you saw, you can type it into the chat. I'll give us just about 10 seconds, and then I'll go to the next slide, which has a blurry but more zoomed in view of what you can see in these nests.
All right, so answers so far: 3 eggs, 2 eggs, 1 chick, 2 eggs, 1 chick, 2 eggs, 1 chick, 2 eggs. So it seems like the consensus seems to be 2
all right.
1 egg, 1 chick.
Let's see our view. Here's it. So eggs can be tricky because one of these eggs has hatched. So in this view, we have 1 chick and 1 egg and an eggshell that was from the hatched chick. Sorry, that was a little tricky, but I did that on purpose to give you an idea of how tricky it can be out here. We are using spotting scopes, but it can be hard to get that really close view of these birds. So especially earlier in the season when these chicks are still really small, there's a lot of question marks, a lot of pluses and minuses as we're trying to get the best view that we can of these nests, but we can't get too close because we don't want to disturb the birds, of course. So it's a little insight into the seabird biology techniques that we use there. All right. Come on. There we go. And there's the chick. To give you an idea of what the myrrh eggs look like, again, they just sit on them on the ground, but the myrrh eggs are speckled again to help them camouflage like the tern eggs, but they're a whole lot bigger. They'll only lay 1, and then they sit on that egg for a while and take turns, just like a lot of the other birds do. Once the chicks start getting bigger, it's a little bit easier to see how many are in the nest. There's 3 in this nest. You can actually see their heads at this point. Most seabird chicks are very fluffy, which is part of why we love them so much. But cormorant chicks are in a league of their own. They are actually born totally bald. So they are just these black, scaly dinosaurs living on this island. It's really an amazing thing to see. They'll start getting their down throughout the season, and it starts on their backs and works its way up their necks. And then they'll get their adult feathers on their wings and their back, and it works its way up as well. But for most of the season, their heads are bald. And it looks and sounds a lot like Jurassic Park on the island for a lot of the season, which is pretty funny. But again, most of seabird chicks are fluffy. They're born with this down to help keep them nice and warm on these kind of cold islands. So this is a roseate tern chick. The seabirds chicks are not waterproof until they get their adult feathers. So they're really stuck on the islands, reliant on their parents to bring them food until they get their adult feathers and they can fly, and then they're waterproof. So this roseate tern chick looks like it was hatched fairly recently. It's really small. It's even still a little bit wet. This is a mer chick, also has a lot of that fluffy down when they're first born, and they have that distinctive wedge shape on their faces. So they look a lot like their parents. Once they start getting bigger, they start to get more of that distinctive coloration that the parents have, like this on their faces. And mer chicks are awfully cute, to be unscientific. But this one still has a lot of its down, so it still has a way to go and before it's big enough to fledge and leave the island. Really the only species we can get up close to when they're hatching are the gulls, because again, they just don't care. So then they lay their eggs all over the island right next to the path. So they're not intimidated by humans at all. So this is a gull chick that's about to hatch. And when they hatch, they look a lot like the terns. They're small, they're very fluffy. They don't act like gulls until they get a lot bigger, and then they start to get a lot more aggressive like the adults do. But as you can see here, this is a gull, a Western gull parent sitting next to its chick. So it is guarding them from us, but it won't fly away or anything as we come close. And this is right, those rocks are the path. They lay them right next to the path all over the island. And this is why we have to wear hard hats when we go outside on the Farallones. For most of this season, we had hard hats on. As the chicks get bigger, we can start to monitor their development by looking at their feather growth. So whether or not they have down and how much, and whether or not they have their adult feathers. So you can see here, these tern chicks have their adult feathers coming in on their wings, but their heads and their bellies are still have a lot of down. But they're more or less the same size at this point as the adults. So these are common terns. Although again, they're still not waterproof. So they're stuck on the islands until they have their adult feathers and they can go out into the water. The last thing we can really monitor are the begging behaviors of these chicks asking their parents for food, which happens more or less constantly throughout the summer. But it's really something to see, especially with these cormorants, and these chicks will raise up their bills towards their parents' faces. Their parents, unlike puffins, which will carry the food back in their bills, these guys actually mostly swallow the food. It doesn't go all the way down to their stomachs. They kind of store it in between, and then they'll partially regurgitate it when the chicks ask for food. And then the chicks will stick their faces into their parents' mouths and eat the food in there. That's dentication right there. So it's definitely a sight to see happening all over the island. And this cormorant chicks, you can see, has all of its down. It's starting to get its adult feathers in its wings at this point. Here's similar behavior from a tern chick begging for food from its parent, who will fly off and find it some food, probably shortly after hearing that. So that's more or less what we're looking for in these birds that have these visible nests that are out in the open. The other category of birds would be birds like these puffins who have burrows, which are a little bit more difficult to see. These birds tend to use their feet and their bills to dig into the soil on the sides of cliffs in order to make these burrows to hide their chicks from predators. Or they will go in between the cracks in the rocks, like you can see this puffin doing on Seal Island. So some of the birds that fall into this category are the tufted puffin, which are found out west and are a little bit bigger than the Atlantic puffin and have these really cool tufts that they grow for the breeding season up on their foreheads. Of course, the Atlantic puffin, the star of Project Puffin, which if you've seen puffins out in Maine, this is going to be the puffin that you've seen, although you can see them on both sides of the Atlantic, so they're really common out in Iceland as well. We've got the razorbill, which are similar in body shape to the mer, but their bill is a little bit more like a puffin. We have these out in Seal, which are pretty cool to see. And some of my favorites, which are not as well known, are the guillemots. We call them gillies usually at Project Puffin. So the gillies, we say, are kind of the less well-known, but equally as cool, if not more, cousins of puffins. Similar body shape, that football, but they're a little bit more slender. And they've got these really cool bright red feet, and the inside of their mouths are bright red as well. So they're pretty cool to see flying around out there. So these are the pigeon guillemots, which are out on the West Coast, and they have this little black crescent on the white on their wing, which is the only difference between them and the black guillemots that we had out here, and also on the West Coast a little bit further north towards Alaska, which have this all white wing. But this is an up close view of their bright red feet, which are just really cool to see them flying around out there. And all these seabirds have the webbed toes as well to help them swim. So with these birds, again, we're looking for similar things at the beginning of the season, mating behaviors. Like this Atlantic puffin is bringing some grass or some leaves into one of its burrows to make it a little bit softer to lay their eggs. Puffins also do this really cute thing called billing, where they rub their bills against each other at the beginning of the season. And I do actually have a short video of some tufted puffins billing that I took when I was out west in California. And I will try to play it, and hopefully my internet works. If it does work, it's a little loud, and including the video just to give you an idea of what it sounds like on these islands. You can hear birds, you can hear marine mammals calling in the not so distant. You can't smell it, but you can maybe kind of imagine it. So take a look at the video. It's just about 20 seconds long if I can get it to play, and try to see if you can see on the video. It's a little grainy, but you can see where there are some tufted puffins billing, and there are some other seabirds that we've seen already that come through as well. So I'll see if I can get the video to play. And after it plays for about 20 seconds, I'll pause and I'll go to the next slide where I'll have a close-up of them as well. Let's see. All right, here we go. So I hope everyone was able to hear it. This circle here at the front is where the tufted puffins were billing, rubbing their bills against each other. They were probably mating and using these little sites over here in order to lay their eggs. Right in front of them after this happened, there were also some pelagic cormorants that landed. They looked like fledglings begging for food from one of their parents. So there's birds kind of all over the place. You can hear seals and sea lions calling in the distance. Gives you a pretty good idea of what it sounds like on the islands. With these birds, since we can't see most of the nests up close, a lot of what we're doing is locating which sites they're using and observing who's coming and going. So you can see right over here, this site is labeled 473. So this is on Seal Island. They tend to use the same sites year after year. So a lot of them have numbers already associated with them. Although if we find that they're using a new site, we'll just give them a new number. So we're able to see who's using which site and if that's changed from year to year. So that's a puffin site. This is a razorbill site. The R is for razorbill. There's a lot less of them, and they tend to be in a different, more remote spot on the island and a lot more recessed and hard to see into. Some of the nests, like this guillemot nest, we actually can kind of see if you climb up on the right rocks. So here on the left, you can see the guillemot egg, and then on the right, there is a guillemot hiding in the back with 2 eggs sitting in front of it. So we try not to bother them too much, but some of them you can kind of see every couple of days if you're careful not to disturb them too much. But a lot of the puffin observation is done from these blinds. Again, they're very social birds, so they tend to sit out a lot together, just being social. We call this the loafing ledge, where the puffins are loafing. They hang out during the day, and your job when you're in the blinds is to record which bands you see, what behaviors you're seeing, if they're using any of the burrows nearby, just kind of what they're doing every day. And everyone's doing that every day throughout the entire season. So I was lucky enough to spend some time in these blinds, and I got to take some pretty cool pictures of these birds, which was an amazing experience for me. I love taking pictures. And this is really the only place that you can get this close to these birds in the continental US is out on these islands, which are pretty difficult to get to. So I had a pretty good time being able to observe them up close and just kind of watching them walking around and hanging out together on the islands. And I also, of course, took a bunch of pictures of the guillemots because I love them. Hanging out on the rocks, you could really see those bright red feet. These are the black guillemots, and then we've got pigeon guillemots as well. You can see the inside of their bills were the bright red in that picture too, which is really fun to see. And then, of course, looking at birds like the tufted puffins, who we can't really get that close to their nesting sites, at least on Cephei, because they were in a much more remote area of the island. So what I was doing was mostly observing who was coming and going, if they were bringing fish back for their chicks who were in their burrows or not. I left my favorite bird for last, which are the ashy storm petrels, which I try not to talk too much about. But the storm petrels are these really cool birds. They fall into the tube nose category. They've got what looks like that tube on their nose. So they've got that heightened sense of smell. These are much smaller birds than a lot of the other tube noses, but the ashy storm petrels breed out on Cephei. And there's a lot of other types of storm petrels, but the leeches are the ones that breed in Maine. So I was able to get a little up close to them too. Storm petrels do this really cool foraging behavior called pattering, where it looks like they almost run on top of the water and they kind of smack the top of the water with their feet. And scientists believe this is a way for them to bring krill, which they eat, up to the surface in order to be able to eat it. So the storm petrels on Cephei nest within the crevices on the side of this path. So every couple of days, my job was to take all the books. We have the Write in the Rain waterproof notebooks, one for each of the different field sites. So you take that out in the field because the gulls are likely to share their displeasure by pooping on anything that you have. So it's got to be waterproof or it won't survive the field season. So I take my ash sheet book out with me and my equipment every couple of days. And my job is to walk around and find as many sites as I can and record everything that I can about those sites. So the sites would look a lot like this. So this is number 80. So they're probably nesting in that dark hole right there. They hang out there during the day and they go out and they forage for krill at night when the krill are going to be a lot more active. It's pretty difficult to see in there. So we didn't really get a great eye view of a lot of them. Although there were a couple that were a lot closer to the surface, like this one right here, which was exciting to see. And this one here. The biologist kept telling me, just wait until you see chicks. It's going to be really exciting. I spent hours for half of this summer just looking and listening and waiting for chicks. And I kept seeing, how am I going to know when there's a chick? And they said, you'll know. And then one day I saw this. Fluff in a crack is what we call this. So the ashy storm petrels and storm petrels in general are very downy, very, very, very fluffy. We weren't able to monitor any of them hands-on because they're pretty deep into these burrows, but I was able to take a few pictures throughout the season, which was pretty exciting, including this one that was just hatched with the eggshell in front, but you could really see up close the tube nose that gives this group of birds their names. So that was a pretty cool experience for me. This one towards the end of the season that was starting to get a little bit bigger. So storm petrels in general are pretty cool. Some of these birds that use these burrows, or live in these burrows, to make it easier to monitor them hands-on and to observe them, will actually construct these artificial burrows, which simulates the burrows that they would use on their own, but allows us to get a little bit more up close. So out on Cephei, the birds that use these burrows are two different types of auklets. The auks are a group of birds that includes the puffins. So auklets have that similar shape, that football shape. Their bills are a little smaller. Cassin's auklets have these really cool white eyes and these bluish gray feet. And the rhinoceros auklets, which are essentially puffins with a name that is not puffin, grow these cool horns on their bills for the breeding season, which is where they get their name, the rhinoceros auklet. So these guys will fly into this tube that you can see. So this is nest box number 34. Fly in and they can lay their eggs in here and hang out with their chicks and deposit any food for them during the day. I included this picture because you can see these gulls just waiting in the background. We had to be pretty careful with the lids on here. They all had rocks on top of them because otherwise the gulls would be able to get in and they would just eat anything that they could find. So we're constantly being cautious about not exposing any of these birds to predators like the gulls. When you look inside the box, if you're lucky, you see something like this, which is a Cassin's auklet chick. This one looks like it hatched very recently. That's an eggshell right next to it. They're only about 12 grams when they hatch. They're very, very, very small, but they're pretty cool to be able to see start to grow up throughout the season. So we would go out every couple of days and monitor every single box on the island. So it was kind of a full day thing with a lot of the researchers on the island. Rhinoceros auklet chicks look very similar, but they are bigger and, if possible, even more fluffy. This is what they look like when they start to get older. They get a lot of their adult feathers in, but still some down there as well. For all of these different categories of birds, we can also monitor the diet, what the parents are bringing to feed the chicks, and kind of monitor which adults are bringing back what type of food to which chicks or which burrows or which nests throughout the season. So this is a guillemot with what looks like a sculpin out in California. And we can kind of link this information to their reproductive success. This is a guillemot with, it looks like a gunnel, which is one of their favorite foods to bring back. Murres make it nice and easy for us by carrying their fish lengthwise in their bills. So we can also record the size of the fish, and we do that by bill length. So if the fish ends at the end of the bill, that's 1 bill length. This might be 1 1/4 or 1 1/3 bill length of rockfish that it's bringing back. Sometimes they bring back cool stuff like this market squid, which is always a treat to see what they're bringing back to feed their chicks. But it really happens very quickly. So this looks like a huge fish, and you'd think you'd have a while to record what species of fish and what size it is. But that chick would gobble down that fish in 2 or 3 seconds. And so you don't have a ton of time to be able to record what you're seeing these birds bring back in. But it's cool to be able to see. And one of the coolest things to see are the puffins bringing back fish. Oftentimes not just one fish like this picture, but a whole bill load of fish. These guys can dive up to 200 feet, although they're usually closer to the surface. And they'll start bringing fish back to the pufflings as soon as the pufflings are born, the baby puffins, the puffin chicks, which is generally around early June, but that kind of varies from year to year. These guys are primarily foraging during the day and not so much at night. I think because that's when their food is more readily available, which is sand eel, herring, and hake get a lot of forage fish such as that. So it's cool to be able to see these guys bring it back. So they'll carry it in their bills and they'll either feed it to their puffling chicks mouth to mouth, or they'll just kind of drop them on the bottom of the burrow and let the chicks eat and go out and get some more. A lot of the times, especially when they're just incubating, one parent will always stay with the nest and one will go forage. Once the chicks get big enough that they won't get too cold on their own and they'll stay in their burrow, both parents can go out and forage and bring food back for their chicks that way. The terns forage similarly, but they'll only bring one fish back at a time, and they tend to forage a lot closer to the surface than the puffins do. They don't have those diving bodies. They're more of those long distance travelers. When we can, we will do hands-on monitoring with these birds. So this is me with my hard hat and 2 rhinoceros auklet chicks on Seppi with, again, one of those gulls just eyeing us in the background, waiting for us to slip up. So you've got to be kind of careful. There's a couple of different ways that we can access these birds hands-on. The chicks are pretty easy to get to before they fledge from the nest boxes or their burrows if we can reach them. The adults are a little bit more tricky. So we can use either mist nets, which are used to capture birds fairly often, or box traps for birds like puffins. And here's a picture of some of the hands-on monitoring. Some of these chicks, these are the guillemot chicks that are pretty easy to get to. As you can see, this one, the red inside the bill, it gives them that really distinctive look. That's me. It looks like this was about to end in tears, but I don't think I was attacked in this picture. But the roseate tern chick was worth it anyway. Sometimes we resort to great lengths. This is one of my colleagues, what we call grubbing, which is what it sounds like, digging into these puffin burrows to grab chicks or adults if they're in there. It's a messy process, but a lot of the burrows are accessible in this way in order to monitor these birds. More often than not, we use these box traps to capture the puffins, where they kind of fall into the inside where there's a pillow for them to land on. But because they need kind of a running start to really fly, they can't leave. So it's easy for researchers to go in there and grab them. So this is what it looks like when you're holding a puffin. They're really small birds. I was lucky enough to be able to handle one of the adults when I was there. And again, since they need that running start to fly, you kind of find a runway for them and let them zip down the runway on their way out to the water, which is pretty cool. The terns, we use these traps in order to trap the adults on specific nests. So this is very obviously constructed by us on the islands, but they work very well if you want specific birds. And the first step is always to remove the eggs so we don't crush them on the nests. So they go in egg crates because those are made to carry eggs. And then the birds would walk through this little entrance hole here, step on this platform, which closes the door. And then we can reach to the top and grab the terns in order to monitor them. Bring them back to the tents, and we can measure things like their weights, give them bands if they don't have bands already, measure bill length like my colleague Stacy is doing with this puffin, although you have to be very careful with your fingers because their bills clamp on. They're good at holding tons of fish at a time, and they're really also good at holding onto your knuckle skin and not letting go. So we don't give them that opportunity if we can help it. But it's really cool to be able to see these birds up close and be able to monitor them from year to year. The rhinoceros auklets are a little bit different. Since they are primarily foraging at night, we use these mist nets, which are mostly used for smaller birds that are terrestrial on land. Although they do work for these guys as well. You have to be pretty quick about grabbing them out of the nets before they jump out and just fly away again. We bring them inside. We monitor them the same way that we just kind of let them go, not on the island, because on this island, the western gulls would snatch them up in an instant. So the technique for these guys is to go to a nice open area where they have a lot of room to fly. You hold them like a football and throw them up in the air as hard as you can. And so they get really high up and they have room to fly out to sea again. So they're not captured by any. The other birds we caught at night are the storm petrels. I was very excited to be able to do some hands-on monitoring. I look really excited in this picture. After watching them in their burrows the entire summer, it was a real treat. We don't really monitor or capture these birds often throughout the summer, just the conditions have to be right. And we don't want to interrupt them bringing food back for their chicks too often. So it only happens once or twice a summer. So we have to make the most of each of the experiences, but it was pretty cool. I've also mentioned banding a few times. So we band these birds to know who's whom. Each band has a unique number on it, and it's individual just to that bird. And there's two types of bands we can use. The Meadow Fish and Wildlife Service bands, which are used across the country. There's only one combination of numbers used at a time throughout the entire country, so it's only for that bird. But they can be kind of small since the number sequence is longer, so they can be kind of harder to see from a distance when the birds are sitting in the nests. So a lot of different projects also use what are known as field readable bands, which are specific just to that project. So Project Puffin would use a different set of field readable bands with their database than maybe PRBO would use. And it could be either metal, and they've got less numbers on them, so the numbers are bigger, or they can be colored plastic to make it a little bit easier to see in the field. There are different size bands for different size legs, so that's kind of how they're sized. We can give the adults bands whenever we're able to get them hands-on. The chicks don't get bands until they're big enough that you can put the bands on their legs and they won't just slip off or get in the way of the chick. So here you can see an up-close picture of me using banding pliers to put this band on this Cassin's auklet chick's leg. We put them in these bags to keep them kind of safe and calm since they're used to being in the dark. It keeps them really calm. And then we line up the edges like this so there's no gaps or openings, so it won't get caught on anything. And they'll have these their entire lives. Doesn't get in the way of them growing or moving or anything like that. This is a closer up picture of the side of the banding pliers. This is me earlier in the season. You can tell because I have a hard hat on. All those gouges are from gull beaks trying to dive bomb us whenever we got close to their chicks. So the hard hats were very necessary. You can also see there's some lovely decoration on my pants from these chicks. We all had a different set of outdoor and indoor clothes. The outdoor clothes did not come inside at any time throughout the season. The cormorant chicks were a little bit different than the rest in that we went out at night to band them just one time at the end of the season because the population is pretty flighty. So we didn't want to go in during the day and scare the adults and the chicks off. But I included this picture because it's a good view of those field readable bands. They only have 3 letters on them. So these are black. It says X something J. This is what makes field science so much fun. If we were observing these birds, we would have to wait for this bird to get up and shift to read that middle letter. It's X something J, but we're not sure. This one is X something L. But you can see this is a lot easier to read than a really small band that has a lot of numbers on it. This is a picture of me that one of my coworkers took because I was in charge of recording. You can see the bag of bands here. I was recording which band went on which bird where. This bird sat with me for about 3 hours and just kind of watched, and they thought it was funny. So, so they took a picture. It was a pretty fun night. It was very different. This is a picture of a roseate tern with both the field readable band that's a lot easier to see and the fish and wildlife band whose numbers are much smaller, which when you have them in hand is easy to read, but from a distance is a lot more difficult to read and to be able to see. So as long as we can see the field readable band and we look in our research records, we can see which fish and wildlife number it's kind of linked with for that bird. This is why we always use the fish and wildlife band and not just the field readables, because they can start to fade, especially the plastic ones, although they are easier to see for the most part. So I've been talking your ears off about how we research these seabirds. The question is why, besides they're just the fluffiness alone, I would think would be enough. But we can also understand a lot about their biology and their behavior, understanding things about wildlife population dynamics, documenting species recoveries, how they're related to their big intricate marine food webs, impacts of climate change on these populations, which is really important. That wasn't enough. These birds are also really great bioindicators, which just means they're kind of a window into the marine food webs. They are really linked to these food webs. They're dependent on the fish and the other food that they can find in the water. As you can imagine, it's a lot more difficult to monitor a population of rockfish under the water than it is to watch these seabirds and see if they're thriving. So if these seabird populations out on Seppi are thriving every year, we know the food webs they're a part of are probably also thriving. So they are an indicator of the health of their ecosystem. We can also apply what we're learning about them to a lot of other fields, such as fisheries management. So if we know that the year I was there, most of the MERS brought back juvenile rockfish to feed their chicks, they can tell the fisheries management people that, hey, in a couple of years when these rockfish are growing up, your fisheries is going to be booming. You can maybe increase the quotas that year, but maybe don't increase it until then because their numbers last year were a little bit lower. So again, it gives you a really good window into that ecosystem. And these birds are really visible and they're there every year. So it gives you a really easy way to monitor them year after year. Hopefully I made these seabirds sound cool and you want to try to find some. They're a little bit more difficult to find than other terrestrial birds because they are generally speaking out over the open water. But there are a couple of ways that you can lay eyes on them. Some can be spotted from the shore, especially if you've got a spotting scope or a friend with a spotting scope, especially after a storm when some of the winds might bring them closer to shore. Depending on the time of year and your location, if you're closer to some of the currents that are bringing those fish that they're foraging for closer to the shore. There are pelagic birding trips that will go out and take birders who want to see birds like these out to the water, looking for birds specifically, especially Project Puffin up in Maine, which I highly recommend if you're ever in the area. It's a real treat to be able to see not just puffins, but guillemots and a lot of the other birds up close on these islands, bringing the fish in for their chicks. It's a pretty cool opportunity. Sometimes pelagic birding trips can be a little expensive. So what I actually prefer to do is to go out on the whale watch boats, if you can find them. They go to the same places that the pelagic birding trips are going, but they just won't talk about the birds on the loudspeakers. They talk about the whales, but the whales and the seabirds are more or less looking for the same food resources. And in fact, the whale watch captains often use the presence of seabirds as an indicator that the whales are present. So everyone else is looking at the whales, which are really cool, but I'm off on the other side of the boat looking at the storm petrels that are flying by. So it's a good way to get out there into the same places that these seabirds are located. If you're unable to get out in the water or you get seasick or you don't live near the water, one other way you can see these birds is by looking at live webcams. And I saw someone mentioned explore.org in the chat earlier, and that's a really great one. And explore.org has live webcams during the season. So in the summer on Seal Island, which is where a lot of these pictures came from, so you can see into some of these burrows and watch the pufflings and the different chicks like the guillemots growing up. And you can watch some of the puffins hanging out on the loafing ledge with these really interesting breeding behaviors throughout the season. So it's kind of another way to get an eyeful of these birds. They're not live now, it's a little too early, but I think they have a lot of archived footage so you can at least get an idea of what it looks like on these islands. All right, so I know I went a little over there, I apologize, but thank you so much for coming out tonight. I was really happy to be able to share some of these pictures with you all and talk a little bit about seabirds. I'd be happy to hang out and answer any questions if I can, if you have any of them. So you're welcome to unmute and ask them or type them into the chat and we'll try to answer them that way. So thank you so much again for coming today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sammy. So if anyone has any questions, again, feel free to unmute and ask, or you can put them in the chat. Really quickly, though, I did want to go ahead and mention that we do have a number of upcoming programs that you might enjoy as well if you enjoyed this amazing talk by Sammy. So on March 3rd, I'll be leading a talk all about the lives of corvids, some of the most intelligent bird species on the planet. And I'll go into depth about their intelligence, their social behaviors, etc. Then on March 15th, we will be hosting Dr. Doug Tallamy, who is an amazing entomologist for the University of Delaware, and he will be giving a talk all about global insect declines and what we can do to help basically native species. And then on March 18th, Sammy will be also hosting another presentation about animal similes and basically what it means to be as blind as a bat or to have eyes as good as a hawk. So if those kinds of talks interest you, you can visit our upcoming events page and sign up and register for them. So we do have a couple questions in here. It looks like one is, where do you find puffins?
Yeah, so if you're in the States, if you're looking for Atlantic puffins, really the only place is going to be off the coast of Maine, or you can go up into Canada and find them there. Or if you want to travel to Iceland, which would be great, there's a whole lot of them out there. On the West Coast, there are both the tufted puffins and the horned puffins, which you can find on some of these islands as well as up in Alaska. So you really got to be kind of north and off to the sides, out over the open water for the most parts. I saw a question that was further up as well. That was, what bird do you really want to see? And my answer to that would be an albatross, because although I actually used some data that some other scientists collected about the wandering albatross for my research when I was in my master's program, I've never seen them in person. So I've read a lot about them and their flight patterns, and they're really amazing birds. And the wandering albatross has this amazing 15-foot wingspan, and I would love to see that in person one day. Definitely on my bucket list.
All right, so we got two that I think are kind of connected here. How many birds wear bands, and how are they caught to be banded?
Yeah, so how many birds wear bands, I think is a great question, and it's going to depend on which program you're working with. So as far as I would say is most researchers are going to band as many birds as they can. The majority of birds that you see out in the wild do not have bands. It's really going to depend on where they're visiting and if scientists are going to be able to band them. So it's a pretty small portion of the birds that you're seeing out there, unless you're at a site like Project Puffin where they've been there for 20 or 30 years and they're trying to band birds throughout the season. If you ever see a bird that has a band and you're able to write down the numbers, there's usually a way that you can report it. If you just Google it online for whatever bird species it is, there's usually a scientist or an organization that's taking that information and would be more than happy to receive that information from you. So be on the lookout for them if you have a feeder and you're able to kind of get up close. Oh, and how are they caught? So we catch the puffins with those box traps that I showed the picture of. That looks like a wooden box, and they're kind of lured to get to the top of the box. And then someone who's hiding in one of those blinds nearby pulls a string that causes them to fall inside. They land on a pillow, so they're nice and safe, but they can't fly out of the boxes because they need that runway running start. So the researchers are able to kind of just reach inside and grab them. Sometimes we can find the adults in the burrows as well, but that's not quite as easy as the box traps are. So that's how we grab the adults to give them bands, at least for the puffins.
So we do brown pelican banding here in the Chesapeake Bay, and you just grab them by, just grab them with your hands, one hand on the beak, one hand on the wings, and you bring them over once they're old enough on some of the islands out in the bay.
Most terrestrial birds, we use those mist nets, the picture that I showed with the rhinoceros auklet. So a lot of songbird banding is done with those mist nets where the birds are caught in the nests, and then the researchers are able to untangle them from the nests and then give them bands and then release them safely nearby.
So how often are the chicks eaten by the gulls?
Good question. Fairly often. Because you're all hanging around, I assume you want to hear this. So the reason why puffins were more or less eradicated from the coast of Maine by the early 1900s was partly because of increased predation by gulls. So the gulls had always been there. They will pretty much eat anything that they can find, including the adults, the chicks, and the eggs. But because humans have increased gulls' food sources, such as trash, over the past couple hundred years, the gull populations really increased from what they were historically at. And so by the early 1900s, there were so many more gulls than there used to be that they really had a big hand in decimating the puffin populations. Humans had a big hand as well, harvesting the eggs and the adults in the area. So those are kind of the two big players as to why there were almost no puffins nesting off the coast of Maine by the early 1900s, and a lot of other seabirds as well. So a big reason why there are researchers out on these islands every summer is to keep the gulls away from the island, because otherwise they would just fly in there, especially birds like you saw, the murres won't hide their eggs. They're just kind of out there in the open. So it's a pretty easy snack for a gull to grab.
Are puffins endangered?
They are not endangered, primarily because, especially the Atlantic puffins, their populations out in Iceland are very high, although I believe that they are a little bit lower now than they have been historically. So although they were almost eradicated from Maine, they still could be found in other places like Iceland and up in Canada. And in fact, when Project Puffin started, in order to repopulate these islands, they actually took some chicks, some pufflings from up in Canada with permission. They didn't just steal them. They worked cooperatively with British Columbia and brought some of those chicks down, raised them on these islands like Egg Rock and Seal, because these birds come back to the islands where they were born, once these birds were raised on these islands in artificial burrows, they left for 4 or 5 years. And then when they were old enough, they came back to those islands with a little bit of help from the project to lay their own eggs on this island. So that's kind of how Project Puffin started.
All right. So more puffin questions.
I'll try.
So can puffins forage before sunrise? And do you have a sense for how early in the morning puffins head out to forage?
It's a good question. When I was out on Seal Island, it was a little too early for them to be foraging, at least for chicks. So I don't have really personal experience with that one, but to my knowledge, they really are foraging when the sun is up, not so much at night. And I think that's partly just because that's when their food is available. Some of these birds that forage at night are looking a lot for krill, which are little plankton and crustaceans in the water, which tend to migrate vertically in the water. So at night they come higher and during the day they go lower. So the birds like the storm petrels that are looking for krill can certainly forage during the day, but a lot of times it's at night as well. So that's the best answer I have for you. I'm sorry about that.
All right. And it looks like one more question here. So why do the gulls eat the chicks?
Good question. Gulls got to eat. Gulls are hungry. So they're looking for food for the same reason all these other birds are eating. They need food for themselves and they need food for their babies too. And gulls, because they're we call generalists. So the puffins we call specialists. They're specialized at just for diving in the water to catch these fish. So they're really dependent on those forage fish being healthy in order to survive. These gulls are generalists. So although they have webbed feet and they can swim in the water and catch fish in the water, they can also eat a lot of other things like trash, which I'm sure everyone here has seen, your sandwich at the beach. They'll eat anything. And if there's a chick sitting out nearby unguarded on the rock, they're going to eat it because they're hungry and their chicks are hungry. So we can't blame them for that, although we can do all we can to try to protect the puffins as well. Because as Steve Kress who is the biologist that founded Project Puffin, we were the reason why they were almost eradicated in the first place. So it's kind of, he believes it's up to us to do all we can to try to monitor these populations, bring them back if we can, because they're pretty amazing birds.
Sure. And let's get one more question in here before we wrap it up.
All right.
So someone wants to know the shape of the eggs and where the nests are built.
Mm-hmm. If there's a relation there?
Not quite sure.
If that was anyone's question, feel free to unmute if you had something specific about that. As I know, historically, a lot of scientists believe that the shape of the egg was to prevent them from rolling off of cliffs because they were pointed. So if it rolled, it wouldn't roll off. But I do believe that that's been more or less disproven more recently. And a lot of scientists are still trying to figure out the relationship between the egg shape and kind of where they're laid. So if anyone knows any more recent information about that, I'd love to know it. But I know there's still a lot more that we have to learn about these birds. It was only until the past few years that we learned where puffins go during the winter. Before that, we weren't entirely sure where they went. So again, we're still learning a lot about them. They're pretty awesome.
But
Right.
Sammy, I have one sort of final one, but maybe you can throw some light on this for me.
Yeah.
I read somewhere that arguably, at least the Wilson's storm petrel and relatives are the most abundant bird species in the world. And one would think, given the vicissitudes of foraging in the open ocean and the weather and the fact that their feeding grounds are actually fairly restricted, what adaptations do they have to let them become so darned abundant?
It's a good question. I've heard that as well, that their numbers are just amazing out over the open ocean. I think that the ashy storm petrel's breeding grounds are pretty restrictive. I think the Wilsons and the leeches are a little bit more open. And I definitely don't have a definite answer about that question, but I would say that they're just so well adapted for flying long distance for being such tiny birds that they're able to kind of follow where the food is. And they use their tube noses and their sense of smell. There's research that's shown now that they can smell what's called DMS, dimethyl sulfate, which is a byproduct of plankton being eaten in the water. And so they can fly around the globe looking for this food, and they're adapted not just for flying, but for finding the food as well. So I've got to think that's got to be part of it, but it's a good question. I would love to
Thanks,
have you
Amy.
there.
All right. Thank you, everybody. If you have any further questions, feel free to email myself or to Sammy, and we'll be more than happy to try to answer them to the best of our ability, of course. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming out and for some really great questions. I hope everyone learned a lot about seabirds. I know I did, and I can only imagine being on those islands in the misty kind of cold weather in the summer and probably smelling quite a bit. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future presentation. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really great.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. All right.
All right.
Good night.
Have a good one.